What's up, guys? The Ancient Greek here, and today we're going to be talking about life inside the famed Seleucid Empire. Now, the Seleucid Empire is by far one of the most impressive Hellenistic states in the Hellenistic period, and it's so impressive because it was actually the largest Hellenistic state in the Hellenistic period. I mean, after Antigonus's whole attempt to reunify Alexander's empire, but I would say Seleucus actually came closer because he almost conquered Macedonia. I mean, he had Macedonia after he defeated Lysimachus, but then he was assassinated by Ptolemy Coronus. But more on that in another video. So, starting with the commoners throughout the Seleucid Empire. Commoners were any range of peoples, all the way from Indians in the Far East, like Indians that lived in kind of the Pakistani region, to the Greek core population in the east of the empire, which was essentially Greece. Ionia was Greece, and then it was Ionia. So the commoners would have had a life of just making a basic living. You've got your artisans who produce special kinds of crafts. You've got industry, and industry was actually a pretty big thing in the Seleucid Empire. And you had farmers, too, wherever they could be. And all of these commoners were so diverse in cultural background throughout the entire empire. The empire was extremely multicultural, and the way that they managed this is incredibly impressive because they actually respected these various cultures throughout the empire during their long reign, which was about 250 years, give or take. So the way that they did this was by having a system of Greek nobles in every major urban center throughout the empire who would live and kind of rule over the regions, their respective regions, as the noble ruling class. And they would answer to the Seleucid government coming from the capital, Antioch, which housed the Seleucid basileus, whoever that might have been at the time. Antiochus the First, Antiochus the Third, Demetrius the First, whoever it was, they would all answer to that Seleucid monarch. And anytime the Seleucid Empire would incorporate new territories, they would have to see if the territories actually had a base Greek population, and if they did, it made it a lot easier because the existing Greek noble class received a few Seleucid-born nobles, a small group, and they kind of came under the control of the Seleucid Empire in that way, that they came under those Seleucid nobles, and therefore the whole hierarchy of nobles versus commoners was already there and already established in that region without even having to express any effort. But if there was no base Greek population, there would have to be a conversion, either a conversion of the noble class in the region, or bringing a bunch of Greek nobles into the region and having them rule the area, and that obviously took a longer time since there was no presence of Greek culture usually in the regions where there was no Greek population. I mean, of course, there's no Greek culture where there's no Greek population. But the Seleucids did this so masterfully that it was often not a huge problem for them, except when it comes to Judea, but that's a matter for another video as well. So, in the way that they managed their multiculturalism throughout the empire, they are known, at least by me, as being the closest to achieving Alexander's dream, because they were able to unify, and not only unify, but develop a relationship between all these cultures. Now, of course, even through all their effort, this relationship would be complicated through their reign, which we will see with, the separation of Parthia and the loss of pretty much all the territories in the east, and the loss of Bactria as well. And Bactria, funny enough, would separate and form their own Greek Hellenistic state with their own mixed culture. So that kind of presented a big challenge for the Seleucids when it came to maintaining that level of skill of handling the multiculturalism in the empire. But aside from being able to handle it, there was the manpower. Manpower was never too much of a problem for the Seleucids, even Greek manpower, because they controlled a lot of Greek territories in the west for a very long time, and they were able to gain a whole bunch of Greeks into the population of the empire and spread them throughout the empire, and they bred Greeks a lot, and they just had a nice solid core even in the eastern territories of Greek population. Now, of course, later as they start to lose territory, manpower becomes more of a problem, and then when the civil wars happen, of course, the number of Greek nobles in certain regions that were controlled determined the manpower that those parties had. And I will be making a video in the future covering the whole period of the Seleucid Civil War and everything that happened during that period. So, now on to the production and also trade inside the Seleucid Empire. So, obviously there's agriculture for producing food wherever it can be. It's not easy in much of the eastern lands, but in Syria and in Mesopotamia, of course, it's actually pretty thriving. So the Seleucids have a nice base of food, and they held on to Mesopotamia for a very long time, in fact. And trade is kind of a very interesting topic inside the Seleucid Empire, because they had trade routes going towards the famed Silk Road and coming out of the Persian Gulf and going to India. They had trade routes going through those areas, but they didn't really emphasize trade as like a huge part of their effort to make money and sustain their economy. They mostly preferred to have internal production of goods, so they had a lot of industry, they had a lot of, and since their territory was so vast, it wasn't that big of a problem for them, because they could have so much industry across their entire territory, and they had a lot of urban centers, so it actually worked out pretty well for them. But they did, in fact, focus on internal production more than trade with the outside world, which is a very interesting thing, because the Ptolemies definitely focused a lot more on trade than the Seleucids did, for sure. They established a lot of connections with India and even sent navigators to India and everything. The Seleucids didn't really do that. Now, life inside the Seleucid Empire in the western territories, I'm going to say that's Anatolia, was kind of like always the same as it was even under the Persian Empire. The only difference was that it was happening under Greek rule. But everything pretty much went the same. I mean, everybody kept producing the same thing, and everyone kept living pretty much the same way. Their culture was respected. Of course, there was a lot of Greek culture and a lot of converts to Greek culture, and Greek culture was, of course, severely emphasized because it's the Seleucid Empire. I mean, it is a Greek empire. But aside from all the Greek culture, life for the common man would have been the same as it would have been under the Persian Empire. Everyday life would have gone pretty much the same. The same. Of course, the only difference is they would have been ruled by Greeks. So, life in the middle of the Seleucid Empire, in Syria, and let's say Mesopotamia, was also pretty much the same as it was under the Persian Empire, only being ruled by Greeks. But Syria definitely had a much larger concentration of not just Greek culture, but I'd say Seleucid culture, since it was the capital province of the Seleucid Empire, and therefore the concentration of Seleucid rule and the Seleucid power base there was very, very huge compared to some of the other territories that were further away from the capital, like the ones in the far, far away east, like Arachosia, which the Seleucids couldn't hold on to for that long because it was literally on the edge of their empire. And the closer you got to Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid Empire, the more you felt Seleucid. And the further away you went from Antioch, the less Seleucid you felt, and the more local you felt. And that is kind of the thing that backfires on the Seleucid Empire as far as their ability to manage all the diverse range of cultures throughout their empire. Because when you respect the local culture so much that you make your empire feel like that, then those cultures are prone to eventually breaking away from your empire, like on the fringe territories. And that was, in fact, a huge problem for the Seleucid Empire. They were constantly losing their provinces in the east and constantly having to try to get them back, and most of the time their efforts to get them back ended in failure. And that is because of their very high respect for the indigenous cultures, to such a degree that they even incorporated like locals to become Greek nobles and lead their respective provinces as Greeks. And of course, they still have the roots of their culture embedded into them. And for that reason, they'll never really forget who they are and where they came from, no matter how Greek the Seleucids try to make them. Now, while this made the incorporation of territories fairly easy for the Seleucids, it also made it so they did not last very long as far as being under Seleucid rule goes. So, the Seleucids had these various pros and cons throughout their empire, but nevertheless their structure was very solid. Their empire was very strong, and their downfall was mostly attributed to military blunders and not seeing things before they happen and all that sort of stuff, like failing to realize the impact of certain events in certain regions. So the Seleucid Empire, while being the closest to Alexander's dream, might have discovered that Alexander's dream wasn't going to work out all as well as Alexander thought it would. I mean, in the beginning, it definitely sounds sweet, and it definitely sounds like something worth trying out, something incredible to be able to unify all these cultures, but some cultures just don't want to be unified with other cultures. They just want to remain independent and be themselves. And the Seleucids would definitely discover that. And they would definitely discover that the Antagonids, who controlled Macedon, definitely had the upper hand as far as not having to worry about losing any of their territory just because of local differences in culture in certain regions, because the territory the Antagonids controlled was all Greek. I mean, sure, there was Thracians in the north, but that didn't really matter because there were so many Greeks in the north too, and the Thracians respected the Greeks as well. So the Antagonids had a nice, solid nation, while the Seleucids were constantly worried about their country fracturing, and that's why they had to be very, very alert militarily. And every time they did have a ruler, Basileus, like take Antiochus III, for example, who did go out and expand, their cohesion would get stronger, because when the Seleucid armies go out, everyone obeys. But when the Seleucid armies are focused in events in Syria, like internal turmoil and the Syrian wars against the Ptolemies, then all the people start to have dreams of breaking away and forming their own nation. Now, as far as the commoners existing in Bactria under the Seleucid Empire, many of those commoners as well as nobles were Greeks. I mean, there was a huge population of Greeks in Bactria. Alexander came to Bactria and he found a whole bunch of Greeks who had been transferred over from the Ionian territories to Bactria as a punishment after the Ionian revolt failed against Persia. So all those Greeks there also ended up having the dream of breaking away and forming their new nation, and they did. They formed the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, and that's actually a very interesting thing, because even the Greeks had that dream, and the reason why they did was they felt so disconnected from the rest of the Greek world that they figured that they should create their own Greek world in the place that they lived. Because even though they were underneath the Seleucid Empire, they felt like since they were there before, they already established their society before, and their little civilization within the Persian Empire, they thought, we're actually different from the Seleucids, and we should go out, strike out on our own, and create our own country, and they did. So that was the one unique situation which happened with the Bactrians, and it's funny because they did it, and the other eastern satrapies in the Seleucid Empire had not thought of it yet. They still wanted to be loyal. So as you can see, the ability to respect the indigenous cultures in the empire always has both sides of that coin flipping back and forth, because the locals had so much respect for the Seleucids that they didn't want to separate, yet they felt like their culture was so prominent, and that later made them want to separate. So there's always rulers, like, of course, the first rulers who were there, the first couple of generations of rulers who were there, uh, after the Seleucid Empire first conquered the territory, would be more loyal, and then later, as the generations go on, they would feel less and less connected since they were further away from the point of conquest. And that's kind of my theory on the problem that the Seleucid Empire faced. So they changed the theme of life to being very Hellenistic, but they didn't change it enough to where those cultures would feel like they needed to convert to Hellenism. They kind of felt like it was just there, and they could enjoy the benefits, but they didn't actually need to, like, completely absorb and completely adopt this new Greek culture that was coming into their lands. And they could kind of be ruled by the Seleucids and reap the rewards of the Seleucid culture that was coming in, but not actually care too much about the Seleucid culture itself. So it was kind of like a constantly flipping situation between a high amount of loyalty to the Seleucid Empire and a high amount of disloyalty. But of course, the nobles themselves, Greeks themselves, are constantly looking to be free and independent, and sometimes that leads them to stabbing each other in the back, which we've seen a lot of times in history. So the Seleucid Empire was a very interesting state in that way, but the fact that they were able to maintain that large of an empire for as long as they did, even though they were losing a little bit along the way, and even though they had that period where they were literally just Syria, and even that was fractured at the end. Even though all of that happened, it's still a testament to how skilled the Seleucids are at just connecting with various peoples in a much better way than any other Hellenistic power could. I mean, at the beginning, Seleucus pretty much stole Babylonia from Antigonus, and he did that because of his high amount of skill in dealing with foreign cultures. I mean, Seleucus, Nicator, he was the only one who kept his foreign wife after the campaigns with Alexander were over. Everybody else dropped their foreign wife, and he was the only one who kept her. So that is definitely a big sign and a big So here we are. We're coming to a battle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in the game, and I'm hoping that my Seleucid force can trump the Ptolemaic force in this fight, because I'm trying to gain control of all of Western Anatolia so I can push into Greece and assist Philip V against Rome, because by then Rome is probably going to get bigger than just the island of Cakyra. But the fact that Seleucus Nicator kept his Persian wife is definitely a huge testament to his ability, not just his ability, but his love for various cultures, various Eastern cultures. And his ability to appease them and to have those Eastern cultures love him in return. And I think all the Seleucid nobles who came after the death of Seleucus Nicator definitely inherited and continued to display those qualities that their original founding member had displayed. So, overall, the Seleucid Empire was definitely the most effective empire in having a nice system of internal production, keeping a nice steady supply of manpower, even Greek manpower, and being able to utilize that manpower effectively on the battlefield against various enemies, of which they had many, just purely due to the size of their empire and everyone who surrounded them. So, and their societal structure was so well laid out that it kind of created a balance of respect and fear that was created through the presence of Seleucid armies and Seleucid garrisons. And of course, once those garrisons were withdrawn, and once that fear was taken away, it definitely posed a risk for the Seleucids in those various regions in their empire. So, in future videos, I'm going to be covering the Seleucid Civil War. I'm going to be covering the details of the Syrian Wars, and I'm also going to be covering the Seleucid calendar system and the interesting story about how the Seleucids actually developed their own calendar and their own years, which probably not many people have heard about. So I'm going to be having more content with gameplay from Rome 2 using the DEI mod, and of course playing as the Seleucid Empire. And eventually I also plan on making a video on the Palmyrene Empire and how the Palmyrene Empire kind of picked up the Seleucid legacy and made the Seleucid legacy come back to life a little bit, at least for a short amount of time. So, the Seleucid Empire is definitely my favorite Hellenistic state, and I look forward to releasing more content about the Seleucid Empire, and have a great time, you Pan-Hellenes. The Ancient Greek is out.